Okay, I suppose we better get started. So this session really is about how you might set up research in your unit if you haven't already done so, which is actually quite a hard thing to do, particularly in the climate of the NHS at the moment. And we have talks here from different spectrums of experience who will share how they've managed to do it and actually the challenges and the opportunities. And this is going to be particularly important going forward because as we've seen in many aspects, urology has led the way in innovation and trials and trial design. And it's only by recruitment that we can actually achieve this. And of course, being able to recruit means you need to have the infrastructure to be able to do it. So we'll start off with Nitin Shroti from Kent and Canterbury Hospital. Tell us about some of the barriers to successful setup.
Good morning, everybody. It's good to be here at BAUS, but as I can see, the first barrier is people turning up, or rather not turning up. So can I thank the chairs for the invite, and thank BAUS as well for the invite. As you can see, I've quite a few associations with different institutions, and I'm hoping that that is what will give me the breadth of experience and perspective to give a balanced idea about what I think is quite a difficult and sensitive subject at times. But hopefully I can sex it up, make it a bit interesting. So let's see how that goes. So the way I approach it, I thought I would think about what I had as my personal thoughts, and then I would look at the evidence base to see if my personal thoughts were sensible or completely nonsensical. So I went for my personal thoughts first, and here they are. That's a picture of a nice, cool, chilled out cat, okay? That's how we see ourselves as doctors, trainees, consultants, SAs, middle grades. We think we are really cool people, we know it all, we are smart. But maybe not. Maybe there's a darker side to ourselves, a shadier side, a less cool side. So let's look at ourselves first. When you point a finger at anybody, anywhere, you will have 3 fingers pointing back at you. So I think we should look at ourselves first, long and hard. And I'm not saying we're lazy. I think we're all very, very hardworking, extremely hardworking people. But for some of us, research is frankly just not a priority. We have other priorities in life. We'd like to lead a busy social life, go out on the town, have a few beers, enjoy our time with our friends, do that sort of thing. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's how we are. Or sometimes we just want to have a decent work-life balance and not work 80 hours a week. Research needs you. That's a very well-known picture, Armstrong and Miller. But do we need research? Well, I'm not so sure that we need research. It depends on our desire and enthusiasm to carry out research. But do we have a professional need to do research? I'm not so sure. Nowadays, we can perhaps do a presentation or two, get a publication or two every few years, and that can get us our consultant jobs, our trainee jobs, and therefore there is no push, no absolute need, no professional need to carry out research. Time is very difficult in this world. It's a 24/7 world, and we are all very, very busy doing whatever we do. Money is also tight, and in research, it matters who you know. If we move on to departmental or hospital or trust factors, the factors on the previous slide, excuse me, also apply. But the number of research nurses we have in our department, that matters too. Sometimes in our department or division, the culture isn't there. Nobody wants to do research. People want to, do their job, hit their targets, do their work, and go home. So that makes a difference too. The local enthusiasm in your hospital also matters because the R&D department may not be very clued on. Lack of financial remuneration to people who do research. Most people who do research do it in their own personal time and do not get separate PAs for carrying out research. The responsibility for this firmly lies with the CEO of the organization. And it does matter whether you work in a teaching hospital, or a DGH. That's all about the system. It's rather nebulous, as you can see. And it matters to the bigger NHS, the wider NHS, whether whatever you're offering for research, is it value for money or not? Because again, as I said, money is tight. It again matters who you know, and depends on your R&D department, how good the R&D director has contacts with your medical director, with the wider NHS, the NIHR, etc. The NIHR is making huge efforts at present to encourage research. But I've been talking to my research delivery managers and the research nurses, and they're all working extremely hard. They cover up to a dozen subspecialties, each of them. And I think time for them to provide the details for work for each specialty, subspecialty, is not easy at all. The ACCA awards in the country have also started going down in number, and that also, shows a lack of appreciation for people who go above and beyond. Patient factors, communication skills, and political interest matter as well. I think patient keenness is something that needs to be cultivated, and for that you need time, you need to have good communication skills, you need to be able to convince a patient that it is beneficial for him or her to take part in a research trial. The political appetite for a particular topic also makes a big difference. For example, stones are not cancer, they are not emotive, so nobody wants to do research for stones. It is very difficult recruiting patients for a non-emotive topic, and that's been my personal experience. But if you give somebody the word cancer, drives so much emotion, and research can be driven very, very easily when you have an emotive topic. Social media. I think as doctors, we are very, very afraid of using social media because I think we love our privacy, and rightly so. But I think social media like Twitter are very, very good, and the NIHR and the CRNs are trying very hard to use social media to publicize various research projects and jobs in research. So these are the various Twitter handles that we can use to get involved in more research. In the past, in my days, as I can say quite safely, an MD or an year in research was very, very vital in getting an ST3 post. But nowadays, again, you do not need to do that. It is no longer an absolute priority for national selection. This is a slightly sensitive area, so pardon me, I don't want to upset anybody, but I might. But I think it's got to be said. The unmentionables. Research can sometimes be a closed shop. It can be carried out by a small group of individuals. It matters who you know. And research is extremely competitive. There are few grants available. The amount of money available for these is small. And therefore, it matters, who you know, etc. There's also a lack of knowledge about the entire way to get a project set up. And a lack of mentorship can make all the difference. Good old Brexit. I'm sure Brexit's going to make a difference. I think it's difficult for you to read from the back, but on the bottom left there, it says that if you have a large number of EU students at the moment, then you will probably be lending your spare lecture theatre space to Amazon or somebody for all the extra unused space, and they'll probably use it for warehouses come Brexit. If you do not have a lot of students from the EU, then very likely you will need to prepare for a lot more competition because money will be short. And if you are funded by other grants already and you have no EU students, that means you probably have clearly a source of funding that no one else knows about. So you better board up your windows and make sure that no one finds out how you get your money. The risks of Brexit, again. As you can see in the bottom line here, medicine, dentistry, and health staff make about 14% of research staff, of health staff. And that means about 7,000 to 8,000 people could get affected by Brexit. Well, when we face a difficulty, we got to be cool like that cat and just deal with it. So let's look at the evidence base now. There's a warning from the Cross-Party Science and Technology Committee that the UK spending on science has recently fallen below the OECD average. Now, that's not good news. As we know, biomedical researchers work hard and work long hours. As you can see, a lot of us work more than 50 hours a week. A lot of us work more than 5 days a week. And not many of us earn more than £35,000 a year. A subset of these, which are from the UK, actually plan on leaving academia. So we can see that research is not attractive. This is from Nature. Now, this is probably the most important and the best evidence I have found which talks about barriers to research. It's a Royal College of Physicians report published in early 2016, and this report was chaired by Professor Margaret Johnson, who is the academic vice president of the college. And this data presented is from a survey of almost 2,000 doctors across all specialties and career stages. I would implore you to read it. So this report was made out from a survey available online for 6 weeks in April and May 2015. It was open to doctors in all specialties across all career stages, including medical students. And there were a total of 1966 responses. So 59% of respondents were male. Most were based in England, 90%, followed by a few in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And the responses were from clinicians in 60 specialties, as I said. The report showed that foundation trainees and consultants were more likely to engage in research outside a formal role. But there was a substantial dip in the CT and the ST years. Now that is interesting, and I wonder if BAUS could give us some idea about why that's the case. Consultants drawn to research also because they found it enjoyable, and for them it makes a difference. For the trainees, it gives them a competitive edge. Now, this is about the ethics process. And this shows that from that study, a lot of people do not have the knowledge about how to go about the approval process, the ethics process. And it takes too long. Sometimes the whole process can take an year or two to get a study completely going. Recently, when I went and spoke to my R&D person about the study, he says, "Oh, how old are you? When are you going to retire, Nitin?" And I said, that just shows that the entire attitude is about, time makes a difference, and we need to improve the speed of how we get these things going. Now, that is another slide, which is slightly busy, but it looks at the knowledge and relationship-related barriers by career stage. So the 5 columns are for the medical students, foundation, core, SPRs, and consultant. And it shows that people do not feel that they have the necessary skills to get started with the research. They do not know how to apply for funding. They do not know how to get ethics approval. They don't feel they have the skills for the research design service, etc. So it shows that people do not feel confident enough, and they feel that these are all barriers to starting off research. Now, this is a busy slide, but it's the last column, which is the very, very tiny one at the end. Again, for similar people. These were people who were either engaged in research formally, informally, those who were interested but not carrying out research, and people who didn't care about research. So that's the 4 columns. But the last column is about financial rewards. And as you can see, that research is not thought to be financially rewarding. And I think in today's world, finance does matter. It does make a difference. So these are the perceived barriers cited by respondents: excessive bureaucracy, a lack of transparency. They felt there was a focus on compliance rather than enabling research. There's also a focus on well-established or big-name researchers around the hospital. So if you're not a well-known researcher, for you to get something going is not easy. There's also no proactive encouragement of research participation across the workforce.
Are we just short of time there?
15 minutes?
You're there.
Sorry. Yes,
Just
okay.
if you
I'll
could summarize, that'd be great.
So there are other studies as well. It's about men and women feel less confident, and they also find research unwelcoming, and they do not think they will receive protected time. These are papers from elsewhere and from abroad, and as you can see, a paper from Australia and New Zealand also finds the same thing, that those in private practice spend less time on research. And finally, a study on pediatrics from North America, also a similar finding of lack of clinical integration, regulatory issues, and lack of community trust. So conclusion on barriers is a lack of motivation for any reason, not enough time, limited resources financially, inadequate appreciation, a focus on big-name researchers, opaque departments, a close-shop approach, a cumbersome process, and ethical difficulties were the barriers to research. So thank you for your time, and sorry for overrunning. That's my wish list there.
Okay.
We'll probably take questions at the end once we've heard from all the speakers.
Okay, the next talk is by Ms. Kim Davenport, and it's Building Trials Capacity in Your Unit, Critical Success Factors.
Good morning. Just to follow on then from Nitin's talk of all the barriers to actually setting up a trials unit, I'd like to say how you can do it, and I am the female that can do it. So I work in Gloucestershire hospitals, namely Cheltenham General Hospital, and I've been a consultant now for almost 6 years. When I started back in 2011, we had 8 urology consultants, 3 registrars, 2 CT and 2 F1 trainees. And we serve a population of about 850,000 patients. And despite that, I was amazed to see that we were participating only in the oncology-led trials. There was nothing being driven by urology. And I just thought that really, a centre of that size, we should really be aspiring to better than that. So where to begin? It is extremely hard work. Nitin's talked about all the barriers, and there are numerous, and they're constantly raised. It is extremely time-consuming. I'm a full-time urologist, and I'm doing this in addition. So there are a number of critical success factors, and I was going to go through them separately. But I think the key things are you have to be patient. You have to remain enthusiastic, because good things come to those that wait, and it can take quite a long time. So I think the most important thing is you have to be keen. You have to have a research interest. And I think by definition, if you're in this room, you're probably the small minority that might have. I was a clinical fellow in endourology in Bristol, which is where I got my initial trials experience. And I was involved in a lot of multiple trials at the time, but also set up an RCT, a multi-centre RCT, and I was chief investigator for that. So I felt I had quite a good basis for them bringing it into the department. There is no time in the timetable at all. And one way I found of trying to help that was I became lead for audit and research, which at least gave me a 0.25 SP allowance. Later on, as you become more established, there are trials with PI reimbursement, but the majority don't, to be honest. I'm sure anybody who knows about GCP training, it's a bit of a hurdle you have to get over, but it is being made a lot easier now, and that stands for good clinical practice. It's an essential requirement for everyone, from the data inputters all the way up to the chief investigators. And it's available locally and regionally. Originally, it was a full one-day course, but actually now the majority are done. I think nearly 90% do it now online. The online is supposed to take about 6 hours. In reality, it takes 4 to 6 hours, something like that. But you have to renew it every 3 years, which is an abbreviated version of the online course. I think it's important to have departmental support, but because without that, you're relying on your colleagues, one, to support you, but also to support you with recruitment and providing the patients. And that goes throughout all the levels. So one of the most important people in one of our trials at the moment is actually one of our CNSs who does all the flexible cystoscopies. And I'm completely reliant on her to identify people for calibre. We also, as part of my lead for audit and research, we have a monthly audit meeting on a Friday afternoon, which gives me the perfect opportunity to nag all my colleagues on a regular basis and reiterate the inclusion criteria and try and make it as easy for them as possible to be involved without having to put too much legwork into it. And you never know, you might actually encourage some of them to join you. You have to be involved with, we have an R&I, so Research and Innovation Department, and it's important that if you come into a department or you're looking to start research, then contact them early. Our department certainly has quarterly forums, which has been a bit of an eye-opener for me about making sure that you accurately give recruitment targets for any trials that you want to take part in, because their funding is dependent on it, and their funding indirectly then affects your funding. They're also, once you get involved, it's very important for you to secure support staff from them, and they're in an ideal position to help you with that. So admin assistants, research nurses and research fellows, if you're lucky enough to get one. For me, the most important thing in all of this is to identify a suitable trial. You do not want to go into a high maintenance trial with you, because when you start, there's no way you're going to get any team behind you because you're not bringing any money in yet. So you have to go for something very, very simple, straightforward. And for me, that was Suspend. The Suspend trial was perfect to start with because I had a very keen registrar who'd been through Bristol, was already GCP trained. He identified them on the ward and recruited them on admission with renal colic. And then I did their follow-up. And that was it. And we did very well with that. And because we'd then proven our targets and we'd proven that we could do it, the research department then started supporting me. And at the time, obviously I didn't have a research nurse, so the easy way to then look at that, which I'll go into in more detail, was think outside the box. Don't go straight to R&D and ask for a research nurse support. I went to our urology nurses and identified a urology nurse who was part-time and actually wanted a few extra hours. And R&D happily supported me with paying for their extra few hours. The NIH CRN portfolio is perfect to look for a trial. That lists absolutely thousands of trials that are all around the country. It tells you if they're still recruiting, if they're still open. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But as I say, the recruitment targets are extremely important. You have to set a realistic recruitment target. And if you identify a population that you think are going to be suitable for the particular trial, whatever number you come up with, half it. Because however many you think will go into it, they won't. And you need to actually have realistic targets so that when you get to the end of the recruitment time, R&D don't throw you out because you're so way off your targets that their funding's all off. So moving back to the portfolio, this is just an example. If you can put any search term in you want. Ours tend to come under renal. But if you put, I've just put kidney stones or renal cell there and got nearly 1,500 returns. You can narrow them right down, but that's where you want to go to identify your first trial. So moving on to research nurse support, like I say, actively look for somebody who's keen to come in with you. Think about your urology nurses, your CNSs, as well as the research nurses. Locally, we have generic research nurses, so we actually get time from a bank now, but starting out, it was with the urology team. And then as you become more involved, obviously we'd all like to have a fellow. And it's how you go about that in the current financial climate. And it is difficult. You've got to go for a hard sell. And we managed it. I managed it quite early on, actually, starting initially with the Research and Innovation Department. I approached them first for sessional support, and they agreed to support a day's worth of fellow time. And then I went back to the trust to see if we could make a full post out of that. And the way we did that, we had problems at the time with the middle grade rota and covering the surgeons cross-covering, all that I'm sure lots of us have. And I sold it to them that if we bring in an extra person, we've got an extra person on the rota, we've got better coverage. You then obviously need to sell it in a better way than that. So I suggested that we backfilled all the cancelled sessions, so cross-covered clinics and flexible cystoscopy lists, trust lists, things like that. And they went for it. And after the year, having was hard work, so I was having to do their timetable pretty much week in, week out, but managed to fully fund it and actually excessively funded it. So it's now a rolling position. And since then, I've now got a second, so we now have 2 fellows. So why do it? Goes back to what Nitin was saying. Personally, I think research is extremely important. We should all be involved to a degree, not necessarily actively, but it affects all of us. Someone has to do it. I think it raises the departmental profile. And the really important thing is that you do actually get some funds back for the department from all of these trials. Yes, a lot of it goes to the trust, a lot of it goes to R&I, the nurses, etc. But we get a third of what's left. And that's important so that I can then support the trainees when they want to go and present their research or their audits. And I think that's important. It does contribute to CEA points. I have managed to get a CEA point, and I think solely because of my research involvement. You do get an SPA allowance if you become lead. And at the end of the day, it gives you a bit of variety. It's something different from your day-to-day job. And I like the patient involvement. So in summary, I feel they're the 7 kind of critical success factors. But I think the important thing to say is do go for it. If you want to do it, it is achievable. Yes, it takes time. It's taken me 5 years, but it's worth it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kim. That was excellent, and we're now starting to answer some of the questions that were posed by Nitin with the first great talk. So can we move now to Rebecca Lewis? Rebecca's from the Institute of Cancer Research, the Clinical Trials and Statistics Unit. She's going to talk to us about what makes a successful research unit from the Clinical Trials Unit perspective.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name's Rebecca Lewis. I'm a Senior Trials Manager at the Institute of Cancer Research, Clinical Trials and Statistics Unit. I've been working in academic urology research for about 10 years now, and during that time I've dealt with some really exceptional sites. So I've basically selected some of the things that they do to put together this talk today. So it's very much my opinion. I do appreciate there are major resource issues at the moment, so also I'd like to add that this is an ideal world scenario rather than something that everyone's necessarily going to be able to take home and do, but I'm hoping that there are a few bits in this talk that will help. So to start off, success, defining success. So I think one of the key starting points is being able to set the trial up quickly and being able to put it in place within a few months. Some sites are really good at this and some sites struggle. Having a recruitment strategy whereby as many eligible patients are identified as possible and offered the opportunity to participate in the trial is also extremely helpful. And then adherence to protocol. I know protocol compliance was mentioned earlier, but it is important that it is adhered to, both for regulatory oversight reasons and also to make sure that the trial is delivered correctly. So it is one of the major points on this slide. Obviously the protocol covers eligibility assessments, treatment pathways, follow-up, data collection, safety reporting. So really, from my perspective, adherence to the protocol is the key attribute of success for sites. And hopefully all of this leads to patient satisfaction overall. So I'm going to run through a few factors that I think contribute towards successfully delivering those 4 things. First off, as our previous speakers have mentioned, enthusiasm. If we've got an enthusiastic PI, we find that that helps galvanise the site staff, hopefully, and that enthusiasm helps people push through any barriers that they might encounter whilst setting up the trial or indeed delivering it. Another thing some sites do is select an enthusiastic person to act as the trial champion. So this could be a surgical trainee, a CNS, a member of the research team, but this person champions the trial protocol, leads identification of patients and acts as the primary point of contact for internal queries about the trial. So this often works quite well because within the site people know exactly who to go to and who is the lead. Another critical point is equipoise. So without equipoise, sites really struggle to recruit. So this can be either personal equipoise or collective equipoise, but essentially clinicians have to be happy that both treatment A and treatment B in the randomised trial would be equally suitable for the patient. Where we've got a situation where one treatment is massively favoured over the other, that doesn't tend to work too well in sites, and patients pick up that reluctance over conversations with staff. Another key thing to consider before starting to set up the trial is feasibility. Look at your patient population. You might think that you've got lots of people like this, but when you come to look at it more closely and aside with the eligibility criteria, you might wind up with a slightly more less favourable situation, shall we say. The other thing to consider is the patient pathway. Is it relatively straightforward from referral, diagnosis to treatment, or is it more like this, where patients could be coming in from any angle? So how are you actually going to identify and recruit these patients? Once you've made your way through the morass of the patient pathway, who is going to do the informed consent discussions and eligibility assessments? Have you got resource in the right place at the right time to be able to do this? All of these things are worth considering as you set the trial up, and it's something that your R&D department or the local network can help with as well. So something that underpins good sites is a good understanding of the trial in general. The foundation to this is GCP Training, as Kim just mentioned. This is available online. There's also a training matrix that helps you determine at what level of trial activity people need to be GCP trained, because it may not be that they need a formal course. So that's all on the Clinical Research Network website. The level of GCP training is also determined by your local policies, because it's not actually set out in law what is required. So make sure you know the steps that you need to take to getting a trial approved, because each different site will have different committees and departments that it needs to talk to. So having that understanding at the start of the trial is really helpful. Making sure that you're familiar with the protocol and the trial guidance documents. Sites which do this in advance of site initiation are it's really helpful to use the site initiation to discuss any issues that you might have discovered with the protocol or the guidance. I would urge you to take advantage of as much training provided by the Clinical Trials Unit as possible. So at this most trials start with a site initiation meeting, and at this meeting it's an opportunity to discuss the background, rationale, and any potential barriers to completing the trial per protocol. The other thing to consider is what to do with new staff. So you can use the training that's provided by the Clinical Trials Unit at the start, but also making sure that the trials unit are aware of new staff, because there might be some training required for whatever particular role that people are doing on the trial. So overall, sites which have got a good broad understanding of the rationale for the trial, what endpoints we're looking at, why we're doing the trial, and what needs to be done to get us there, really helps reduce the number of queries and the number of issues that can develop at site. So the other key element is organisation. Again, starting at the beginning, pushing the trial through. Trial setup is not always as easy as we would hope. Some sites have really smooth setup pathways, which work brilliantly, and they can set trials up within a month, but that tends to be some of the more research active sites. If sites are not as research active, it really helps when the PI gets involved with any sticking points in the setup process and has discussions with any relevant departments and the R&D and the committees involved. Organised patient recruitment pathways, so you know how you're going to identify these patients, who's going to do it, when are you going to approach them, who is going to have the informed consent discussion, and who is going to assess eligibility. Oh, sorry, I'm going backwards instead of forwards. Sites that plan out the trial treatment pathways and trial assessments in accordance with the protocol. So they may have crib sheets, they may pre-book appointments in advance of randomisation and cancel one if the treatment timelines are tight. Stickers on patient notes, flowcharts, anything that might help make sure that those patients stay on track. And the same applies to data collection. Often sites that have a main person for the data collection, so a data manager rather than necessarily a research nurse, we often find that they are more successful in getting the actual data back to us in a timely manner. The other thing to consider in terms of organisation is safety. How are you going to adhere to the safety requirements in the protocol, safety reporting, who is going to identify any events and who is going to assess them and report them. So hopefully having this underpinning will help with delivery of the trial overall. One of the key things that underpins all of that, though, is communication. So sites, this applies to patients within site and the clinical trials unit. So sites which have clear communication pathways for patients to contact clinic staff if they've got any concerns about the trial. Having a system within the site, as I've already mentioned, for making sure that eligibility queries, SAE reporting, and any other concerns can be discussed. Sometimes we find that sites don't necessarily actually discuss issues, so the research staff don't necessarily discuss issues with their PI, but they come straight to us. So having that process for the research staff to talk to the PI and have that iterative process within site helps reduce the number of queries. That said, there are always questions, especially when we've developed trial protocols. We're trying to get them to fit as well as possible in the real world, but when you actually start using them, you might find there are hitches or things that don't quite make sense. So having that open dialogue with the clinical trials unit really helps as well, because it means that we know what's going on, we know what your concerns are. Yeah, I was going to make another point, but it's completely slipped out of my head, I'm afraid. But that links to my next point, which is feedback. So this doesn't necessarily relate to being a successful site per se, but it really helps us successfully deliver the trial overall. So as I said, if people have got any questions about protocol or guidance that isn't clear, if they've managed to straighten out or smooth out their recruitment pathway somewhat, then telling us how you've done that helps us to help other sites that may be in a similar situation. And finally, feedback on our processes. Sometimes clinical trials unit, with the best will in the world, can get a bit overboard in terms of the requirements. So if, for example, you're being asked to complete 100 forms where one will do, tell us, and then hopefully we can streamline it. So as I said at the start, I completely appreciate I'm presenting an ideal world scenario here, but as previous speakers have mentioned, there is support available. Now, the NIHR Local Clinical Research Network gets funding for every patient who goes into a trial, every trial that is set up, and every trial that is delivered to time and target. So they are available to help with NHS service support, and the way you access that might be through your R&D department. It very much depends on the local pathway. But the Clinical Research Network should be providing support for any trials that are in the non-commercial trials portfolio, provide support to provide access to various departments for support, and also access to their research support staff. So they are worth contacting if there are issues. Also, and I can't say this strongly enough, tell us if something is going to plan, because the more we know about it, the more we can help you. We might have had similar things come up in the past. We also have, a lot of the trials units have avenues for national escalation of issues. If it's something that's impacting more than one centre, we're able to feed that back nationally through the NIHR structure. So those are just some of my thoughts. I would welcome questions at the end. I'd also welcome any of your thoughts on what makes a successful clinical trials unit from your perspective as well. We do have a stand in the exhibition hall. I think it's number... Do you know what? By the toilets. So if you happen to be nipping to the toilets during your lunch hour, do pop by and see myself or Rachel if you're interested in having any more discussions about this or about finding out about some of the trials that we conduct. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's a fascinating idea, actually. I've just thought of a new way to get interest. Put the stands next to the loos rather than in the center. Yes, I'm glad to see the speakers are hovering around the front, because we will have questions at the end. We've got Hugh, there you are, Hugh, who's going to get ready for his presentation. But I would encourage people to put questions together at the end, because we will have time for this. If you're too shy to stand up, then there is the app, so you can send it through on this thing here, which we haven't had flashed this session yet. So we can ask the questions on your behalf. So we've had a pathway through the difficulties, the opportunities, the insight from the other side of the coin, which is CTUs. And now Hugh is going to tell us about how to get a trial from an idea in his head. It was your head, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Yes. To funding and implementation.
Thank you. And I often wish that idea hadn't come into my head. So I'm going to give you a very personal opinion about how to try and get funding for your idea. If you go onto most of these funding websites, there's some fairly tedious paragraphs and paragraphs about what you're supposed to do. This is almost how you do it by accident. So, to my mind, breaking it down, I think you first of all have to come up with an idea, obviously. The next thing is to discuss that idea and then go and discuss it some more, and then discuss it some more, and just keep going, because you'd be amazed how many times you think you've got a brilliant idea, and actually after a bit of criticism from other people you realize that it's rubbish. The next thing is to get some professionals in. So either use your local research design service, or if you're lucky and there's one local, a clinical trials unit. I'll talk about these in more detail. Then with their help you can apply for one of the recognized funding streams, and then you have to sit down and write the protocol or the application. Basically they're both kind of the same thing. So talking about the idea, I really feel this is, if there's nothing else that you listen to in my talk, this is the one thing. I just think you really have to find something that you yourself are interested in or curious about. Actually, there's a lot of things in our day-to-day clinical practice that just don't make sense. So there's plenty of ideas out there. Some people don't seem that interested in finding out why, but I don't quite know why, but I was curious about a couple of things. So unless you're really interested in that idea, I don't think it's going to work. The next thing is, I think you have to discuss it with your colleagues and see whether it's interesting to them, because quite frankly, if people who you work with or who are your friends don't find it interesting, then the kind of audience here who've never met you before aren't going to find it interesting either. The other thing which is, I think, really important is, will it interest patients? So there's a lot of ideas that people come up with that is interesting to them, but will be unappealing to patients. And particularly now, patient involvement has to run through all aspects of the trial. And so right from the start, try and make sure that it's an idea that is going to interest patients, because if you've got a trial that patients are interested in, when you start telling them, that's so easy, and if it's difficult, it's hard. And then this is probably another really big thing, is try and think about whether it will recruit or not, because the biggest disappointment in a trial is to get it up and running and then realize that basically it's not going to recruit, because no one has any sympathy for you when that happens. So, who do you approach? Again, this is my own personal view. A lot of hospitals have got a research design service. There are local clinical trials units. So, for example, my local one was Southampton. And then there are the specialized clinical trials units like the Institute of Cancer Research that Rebecca works for, that basically just do cancer trials, and quite specific ones at that. So my comments about this is that I think the research design service is absolutely fine if you're thinking about starting off and you've got a very small trial, perhaps probably in your own hospital. They're a very good place to start. One thing to say is the whole point about a trial is you need something like a clinical trial unit to oversee particularly not just the application process, but the running of the trial once it's up and running. And that's really the difference between a research design service who can help you design the research and put the application in, but there may be a few exceptions, but certainly the ones that I know don't really know how to then see a trial through to fruition. Local CTUs are good, but one of the problems with RDS and local CTUs is that they won't be used to doing, unless you're lucky, they won't be used to doing the kind of trial that you're interested in. So our particular area was urological cancer, and particularly bladder cancer. And the thing that made a massive difference was going to a specialized CTU like ICR. And anyone who's worked with them uses the same phrase, which is that they're the Rolls-Royce of clinical trial units, and they really are, because there's nothing worse than going to a trial unit with an idea and they just don't get it. So they don't understand how bladder cancer works, they don't know what recurrence rates is, and you have to kind of break it down. I've had conversations with statisticians where you bring them all this recurrence data and they just look at you blankly and say, can you go back and do it as a 1 or a 0? Because basically that's how I'll work it out. And the problem is that the data they give you back doesn't really make any clinical sense either, because they've just interpreted a sort of binary events without really putting any insight. Whereas if you deal with a trial unit, if you're lucky enough to deal with a trial unit that has experience, it makes it so much easier, because ICR had already done a couple of bladder cancer trials, so when you were talking to them, they already knew what kind of effects you might get, etc., etc. One thing that I've put the asterisks to is statistics. You need to know absolutely no statistics to apply for a trial. So I think that's one of the myths that I was terrified about, was that I'd be found out for not knowing any statistics. And in truth, it all happens by magic, and that's the whole point of getting a good trials unit behind you. What is very important, and what they rely on you, though, is to give them a realistic idea about recruitment, and also what you think the sample size will be and how long you think you'll recruit that sample size. So those are the three things that I've realized. If you give them the wrong data with that, everything else will go wrong. So if you think that the sample size is too big, or you think that will recruit within a year and there's no chance of you recruiting within a year, that's where their calculations start to go wrong. So the main responsibility of the CI is to really do their clinical homework and come up with sensible ideas for recruitment and sample size and recruitment time. So then the other thing is, how do you choose a funding stream? Again, I've put these sort of almost in order of complexity and difficulty. So there are a lot of local or hospital charities. So for example, we've got the Urology Foundation, who are excellent at funding small grants, Action on Bladder Cancer. Then the national funding streams tend to go up in size and complexity. So the one we managed to apply for and get funding was Research for Patient Benefit. Ballpark, I'm told, they fund things around 300,000 to 400,000. Then CRUK have the CTAC stream. That tends to go up to, I believe, around 700 to 800,000 pounds. And then HTA is one of the bigger trial funding streams, which is, generally speaking, 1 to 2 million. These are very rough figures, but essentially it gives you some idea that basically you have to pick the funding stream to fit with the size of your idea. And generally speaking, it's best to start at the top with a smaller idea if you think you're just starting off, and then work your way down there. And those are the 3 of the nationally funded ones. These are particularly the ones we use for cancer. There are probably some other ones as well. But there is a simpler way than all of that, and it's the way that I ended up standing here, which is that, as Kim was talking about, you find a trial that you're interested in. In my case, it was BOXIT with non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. You recruit lots of patients to it, and one day you get an email saying, would you like to join the trial management group, which is the group of clinicians who oversees that trial. Once you've done that, in urological cancer, the CRUK run these clinical study groups, which are basically a group of clinicians who are interested in a particular cancer site and who oversee the development of trials. So you get invited, for example, onto the bladder cancer clinical study group, serve an apprenticeship for 2 or 3 years. The first year or 2, you've got no idea what people are talking about. And after a few years, things start to sound, oh, I think I've heard that before. They ask you to be co-investigator on their trials, and eventually, when you've been sort of hanging around long enough, you step up to the mark and try and be a chief investigator yourself. So my top tips, if the head of your department comes up to you and says, I think part of your job plan this year would be to try and fund a trial, just try and duck it and volunteer for nearly anything else, because unless you've got the enthusiasm to see this through, it will just be a complete nightmare and you won't do it. I just don't think, unless you're doing it for yourself, you won't do it. Learn from the expertise of others. There are loads of people who are far better at trials than you are. I learned most of my clinical trial experience from John Kelly, one in particular, and also Rebecca, who's sitting here on the front row. She probably thought I was an idiot for most of the time, but you know, they've got a lot to teach you. Get used to waiting. There is an inordinate amount of time. So when we put the application in for Calibre, 9 months passed and I'd completely forgotten about it till we actually got a reply back. And also take the long view. So I just want to show you what's happened with Calibre. The idea came out in 2009. The application went in 2012. So it took 3 years of discussions going back and forth to the clinical study group before we had an application. 9 months later, the funding was successful. We launched the trial in 2014. It's closing in 2017. And if we're lucky, I'll probably get 2 minutes at the bladder cancer session at the EAU in 2019 to talk about it. So that's what I meant. It's got to be personal. You've got to do it because you want to do it. And as I say, be prepared for very, very long periods between anything happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I'm not sure whether that encouraged you or discouraged you, actually. But we shall see. Is there a mic we could bring down to the front for the speakers? Oh, Okay, well, there's one on the way anyway. Okay, any questions? This one.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I work in a unit which is relatively research naive, but very strong on cancer performance. My question is, how do you reconcile cancer research with cancer targets?
I mean, I'm sure the others have a view. I think one of the reasons I got into doing research as a clinician was that actually recruiting patients into trials is one of the easiest ways to hit cancer targets, because there's such tight criteria when you're in a trial. It's advantageous for your patients to be in a trial in order for their timelines to be met. I don't know if Kim, you've got any thoughts?
Kim or Nitin, any views on that?
I'm not involved in any trials that are upfront first treatment, so Calibre, say, is recurrent treatment, so I don't really have that experience, but I would say the same, that the timelines are very tight, that actually I think research patients generally get a better deal when they get earlier treatment, I feel.
Nitin?
Can you just repeat that for me, please? The question.
I think the question, Nitin, was how do you reconcile recruitment into trials with cancer targets?
I think there's one way of doing it. If you can convince your trust to actually give you special theatre lists funded specially for trials, then you could use that. Because that's one way of getting around not finding space for patients who need surgery to get them into trials. So if your hospital gets some money for the patient, then you could use that money to fund a theatre list, which you could carry out, and then there's no guilt there in any way. And also you can find a list space quite easily depending on people's annual leave, etc.
I would also add to that there's also, depends on what you mean by a cancer trial. So, for example, a new drug on a cancer trial is considered a treatment. And so if your patient gets a treatment, then you're off the target, which just goes to show how artificial the whole thing is.
Yeah, please.
Grant Stewart from Cambridge. So, question for Rebecca. You may not want to answer this with the current audience, but surgical trials in general are challenging. It's not just in urology that we've run into problems with recruitment and failure to complete studies. You work with oncologists as well as surgical oncologists. Is there anything you think that's different in the surgeon as a beast versus the oncologist that you've observed in your years of working across different trials?
Thank you for that question, Grant. I think they come from different ethoses often. So oncology is very research driven, and it's had a lot of money poured into that for years and years and years. I think urology can be more used to doing things like audits and case studies and things like that. So it's getting the RCD paradigm into urological thinking, really. And I think it's improving over the years that I've been involved in trials. I think we've got more and more active urologists that we can call on as a clinical trials unit. I think the other thing goes back to the funding as well. So it's not necessarily a personal thing or personal traits of urologists versus oncologists, but the oncologists are embedded in a research structure normally. They have got research nurses down the hall from them, whereas urologists are often trying to find a bit of a research nurse somewhere that can help with things. So I think it's just a question of building up the portfolio so that that resource is there, and making sure that you're getting hold of some of the resource from the research that's actually going on in the hospital, even if to start almost pump priming your own portfolio within urology. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. I think it's useful for us to know that it's not us or our views on research, it's the whole infrastructure that surrounds it that we need to get more control of. I think that's probably what you're saying, isn't it? That's helpful, thank you.
Nitin, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, thank you. If I may add to that, I mean, I see that happen in places. And when we sit at our MDT, for example, when oncology discuss a patient, the first thing they say, is this patient suitable for any trial? And the oncologist, the cancer nurses help the oncologist with that. With the urologist, there is no one to help them. And I wish, we could do that in our MDTs for the surgical side as well, that we should have a research nurse who says, there are these 5 trials, which trial will this patient go into? And that does not happen. And we need to make that happen. And though I spoke on barriers, I think we are all very enthusiastic, and it's definitely possible to carry out research, just a matter of time and keep pushing at it. Thank you.
Could I maybe, just before the gentleman there on the floor, could I just follow up that with a question? I think initially to Hugh, if that's okay, because it's something you didn't touch upon. So I've made a summary here, a very simple summary of trying to establish good research in your hospital. I've written you need time, you need resources, you need training, mentorship, and a good question. And if I now work backwards, Hugh's told us about how you perfect your question, you speak to your peers, mentorship is important too. Rebecca's talked about training. There's training available, which we should take more advantage of, speaking personally. Resources, Kim's touched on, and this is one of the big problems, trying to get your research nurses, trying to work with the CLRN nurses. But it brings me back to the first one, time. And do we have any solution to the time for us in busy clinical jobs? Kim talked about having 0.25 PAs, as in being in charge of research and audit. But I just wonder, Hugh, how you managed. Was this purely in your own time?
Yeah, I think the way I look at it is that sooner or later, if you just do clinical work, you get bored. Doing the same timetable day in, day out for 30 years, unless there's something slightly strange about you, it's not very exciting to do it for 30 years. So, I do it in my own time, but I don't want to make out that it's some kind of, personal sacrifice. It's just about one of the things that is quite interesting to me after nearly 2 decades of being a urologist.
Kim, do you want to add to that?
I would say the same, because I do the majority of it in my own time. The audit meeting alone takes up most of the allowance that I get for the lead for that. It is all in my own time. You still have to do everything else, so that can't wait. But you do. That's why you have to want to be doing it. You have to be committed to it. There isn't much thanks for it, really. Just do it for yourself.
My name is Dapo. I was just wondering, listening to all the excellent speakers, if you look at the problem with little funding, the divergence between people interested in research and everybody in clinical practice and time. And I was wondering for urology in UK as one, whether there will be any benefit in taking the same role as mathematics did years ago. If I was talking like for the mathematicians, they did the millennium targets. If as a group we could decide these are the fixed questions we want to answer within the next 10 years, maybe rather than there being several hundred small trials looking for simple questions, if we could have local units of trust motivated the fact that each person is trying to answer one out of these questions, whether that would help with funding application or bringing together small units funding or small trust together, maybe half PA from this hospital, half PA from that. I don't know, but I was wondering whether fixed questions, pick 10, for instance, about 10 years and try to address it, whether that would help us or not.
That's a very, very, very valid point. Are you a consultant at your hospital? No. Have you ever been to a consultant meeting? No. So part of the answer to your question, I would suspect, is actually consultants agreeing on anything. But actually, Rachel, maybe I could get you to look at this from an ICR trials unit point of view, as how trials are approached. How do they come to you? Because, of course, there are lots of different trials. There is the investigator-led trial, Hughes mentioned that. There's commercial trials. There's obviously CSG-driven trials in cancer. There's a whole morass of ways of how they come through, isn't it? Why can't we do that? Why can't we have a central UK trials unit which looks at all the trials, streamlines it, allocates it to units?
I'm not sure it would work quite like that, because each different clinical trials unit will have its own area of specialism. Certainly some trials units, such as mine, we're involved from the very early stages. So when Hugh was presenting the start of Calibre, we were involved from way before the RFPB funding application goes in. So it's not a question of just parcelling things out and giving them to trials units. You have to have that expertise in the trials unit, really helps. But the idea of prioritising several questions sounds very similar to what is done within the clinical studies groups for cancer. So the renal and bladder clinical studies group, for example, will develop up several questions. So actually having that in a non-oncology environment might be really helpful and might boost ability to get funding if you can demonstrate there's consensus that this is a key question that people in the UK are keen to find out the answer to. I think that would definitely be a useful thing to do. How you do that is another question.
Thank you very much. I don't think we have anyone from the BAUS committee here, do we? Just for a view on whether BAUS can take a lead on that. Maybe we'll leave that for another. Oh, we do. Can you pass the...
Yep, Simon Williams, I'm on the BAUS Council.
Do you think BAUS could take a view on prioritizing trials and then identifying the trials units and then allocating maybe?
The trouble with BAUS is that you've got every different speciality represented there. So I wonder whether, for instance, the section on oncology and the section of female urology and so forth, it should be the sections rather than BAUS itself, is my personal feeling.
Thank you.
John Ainey from Newcastle. I just want to make a comment on the last point, because I think you raise a really valid point that's important. I think just reflecting back on the discussions that I've heard this morning, we've talked a lot about our focus, but the reality is that good clinical research improves care for patients, and actually instigating a lot of research studies for clinical questions does not add significant time in once you have focused on the pathway. If anything, it actually improves care. So I think actually you've got to take your point and put it the other way round and go, well, actually in our unit, this is what we're really passionate about, or bladder cancer is a real problem, or superficial bladder cancer is an issue, and then prioritise that to then look at the trials that are suitable for you. And I think if you take that approach, you will not only recruit well, but you'll find success follows that.
Thank you. Caroline?
Thank you, Caroline Moore, UCL. I think it's great to have this open discussion about how to get research going across different units. And I just also wanted to put the point for formal training in clinical trials. So there's clinical trials certificates and MSCs, which can be done online, module by module, which are very useful. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine has one that's particularly good. And for the trainees here, there's also the choice to pursue an academic training route where you would get formal training in clinical trials, if that's the sort of academic training you want to do, as well as mentoring and working on trials at the same time as your clinical training.
Okay, thanks very much. I have a question from the floor here that's come through, so I'm going to, Kim, if you don't mind, I'm going to direct it at yourself because you've partially answered this question in your talk. The question is, what's the best way for a core trainee to get involved with research when the hospital you're working in is not particularly active in research?
I think as a CT trainee, you may not, I think it's difficult. If you're in a centre that's not active, then you're going to have limited exposure at that point. But moving on from there, there are still clinical fellow posts, you know, like we have 2 fellow posts, there are them around the place, so that if you are interested in research, then that's a stepping stone between CT and ST training. I think it's difficult to get involved while you're at the CT level if they're not involved. You can do audit projects and other interesting projects in the meantime. You can do your GCP training in advance so that you're set up the minute you walk into a post. And I think if you were going to a clinical fellow or research fellow interview and were already GCP trained, that would put you in a positive position for that post.
Hugh or Nitin, anything you want to add to that?
I think it's very hard if you're a trainee who's keen on research to try and do anything when your bosses are not that interested. One thing I would warn you is not to pick up one of their ideas, because it won't be much good. I mean, a number of times I heard as a trainee say, oh, just look up these 400 sets of notes and it'll be a really good abstract for BAUS. And it's just a lot of hours. So probably best to skip that year and focus on going to a department where they do high quality clinical trials.
I would probably advise him to try and go and meet his R&D department and find out which department in that hospital is doing research. And if he can find a project that might interest him, he could sort of turn that into a positive thing. And quite often I feel that every department is quite likely to have at least maybe one consultant who's keen on doing stuff. So I think that's what he could do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's very good advice there. I think we've time for one more question, please.
Just to comment on the last point, if you're a core trainee and wanted to get involved in research, if you look at the seats beside you, there's a great opportunity here. The BURST Research Collaborative offers core trainees who have limited amounts of time a way of getting involved in research. So you have to look no further than the seat next to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you much. Thank you for the speakers for fabulous, really real-world talks, which is exactly what the session was about, and also all of you for participating and contributing. I think we have a major challenge in urology because, as Nitin pointed out, the audience here is not as large as you might expect, and I suspect it's because people don't realize what's possible and they just look at the barriers. But I think we've heard they can be overcome. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.